Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Tonight, we venture into the shadow-drenched alleyways of old Shanghai, where the morning mist carries secrets and the evening lanterns illuminate stories the respectable world prefers to forget. Picture, if you will, the year 1895. The air hangs thick with opium smoke and unfulfilled dreams, while somewhere in the distance, a gramophone plays a melancholy waltz that drifts through paper-thin walls. Have you ever wondered what happens when desperation meets opportunity in the darkest corners of human society? What transforms ordinary women into figures of both desire and tragedy, painted in rouge and regret? The story I'm about to share with you reveals how colonial Shanghai became a breeding ground for addiction, exploitation, and survival, in ways that would shock even the most worldly observers of our modern age. In the labyrinthine streets of the international settlement, where gas lamps flickered against the perpetual fog rolling in from the Huangpu River, lived women whose stories have been whispered about in hushed tones for over a century. These were the painted ladies, the flower girls, the forgotten daughters of Shanghai's colonial underworld. Their tale is one of systematic destruction wrapped in silk and perfume, of addiction that destroyed not just individuals, but entire communities, and of a trade that flourished under the very noses of those who claim to bring civilization to the East. But this isn't just another story about vice and corruption in old Shanghai. What I discovered while researching the archives of the municipal police files, the missionary society records, and the private journals of foreign residents will fundamentally change how you understand the relationship between colonialism and human suffering. The painted ladies weren't just victims of their circumstances, they were pawns in a much larger game of economic exploitation that reached from the opium fields of India to the drawing rooms of London's financial district. The web of addiction we'll explore tonight reveals something disturbing about human nature itself. How ordinary people, when placed in extraordinary circumstances, can become both perpetrators and victims simultaneously. How entire communities can be systematically destroyed through carefully orchestrated campaigns of dependency and despair, and how the pursuit of profit can transform even the most intimate human relationships into commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. Let me transport you now to Foochow Road, where the neon signs haven't been invented yet, but the promises they would later advertise were already being whispered in doorways and behind curtained windows. The year is 1898, and the morning air carries the scent of jasmine tea mixed with something far more sinister. Something sweet and cloying that seems to seep from the very buildings themselves. Walking down this bustling thoroughfare, past the silk merchants and curio dealers, past the foreign gentlemen in their pristine white suits, and the Chinese compradors in their traditional robes, you would notice something peculiar about certain establishments. They bore no obvious signs, no gaudy advertisements, yet somehow everyone seemed to know their purpose. These were the houses where the painted ladies lived and worked, where addiction took root and flourished like some exotic, poisonous flower. The story begins not with the women themselves, but with a decision made thousands of miles away in a boardroom overlooking the Thames. British merchants, having saturated the Chinese market with Indian opium, were searching for new ways to maximize their profits from this lucrative trade. They had created millions of addicts, but addiction alone wasn't enough. They needed to create an entire ecosystem of dependency, one that would generate multiple streams of revenue while ensuring their customer base remained permanently enslaved to their products. Someone, and the records suggest it was a consortium of traders working in cooperation with local Chinese crime syndicates, realized that opium addiction could be exponentially more profitable if it were combined with another of humanity's most powerful drives. If they could create establishments where men could satisfy multiple addictions simultaneously, where the ritual of consumption became intertwined with human intimacy, they could command premium prices while ensuring absolute customer loyalty. The painted ladies were the human face of this calculated strategy. Young women, many still teenagers, were recruited from the countryside, where famine and civil unrest had left countless families desperate for any source of income. The recruiters, often well-dressed women who spoke of opportunities in the great city of Shanghai, promised steady work, fine clothes, and the chance to send money home to starving relatives. What these young women didn't understand was that they were being recruited not just as companions, but as unwitting agents in a campaign of systematic addiction. They would be trained not only in the arts of entertainment and companionship, but in the subtle science of creating and maintaining drug dependency. They would learn to recognize the signs of withdrawal, to time the administration of relief, and to use their intimate access to their clients to ensure that temporary customers became permanent addicts. The training process itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. New arrivals were housed in comfortable quarters and treated with apparent kindness. They were given beautiful clothes, taught to apply elaborate makeup, and instructed in conversation, music, and the social graces that would make them appealing to their intended clientele. For many, this initial period represented the best living conditions they had ever experienced. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, opium was introduced into their daily routine. At first, it was presented as medicine for the nerves, a common practice among respectable women of the era. Small doses were added to their evening tea to help them relax after their training sessions. The doses increased slowly, so slowly that the women barely noticed their growing dependence on these moments of artificial peace. By the time they realized what was happening, they were trapped in a web of addiction from which escape seemed impossible. Their bodies craved the drug with increasing intensity, while their minds remained clear enough to understand their predicament. They had become unwilling experts in the very substance that now controlled their lives, and this expertise would be their primary tool for survival in the world they were about to enter. The houses where they worked were architectural marvels of calculated seduction. Every detail, from the placement of the furniture to the color of the lampshades, was designed to create an atmosphere that would encourage both relaxation and consumption. The main rooms featured low couches arranged around ornate opium pipes, while smaller, more intimate chambers were furnished with silk cushions and delicate porcelain accessories for drug preparation. The daily routine in these establishments followed a carefully orchestrated rhythm. Afternoons were reserved for preparation and the cultivation of the proper atmosphere. The women would spend hours applying their elaborate makeup, painting their faces in the distinctive style that gave them their collective name. White powder covered their natural skin tone, while dramatic red paint outlined their lips and colored their cheeks. Their eyes were rimmed with black kohl and adorned with intricate designs that varied according to their house's particular aesthetic. As evening approached, the first clients would arrive, usually foreign businessmen seeking relaxation after a day of commercial negotiations. The women had been trained to recognize different types of customers and to adjust their approach accordingly. New clients required gentle introduction to the house's offerings, while regular patrons expected immediate access to their preferred combinations of services and substances. The consumption of opium was presented as a social ritual, something sophisticated and refined rather than a dangerous addiction. The women would prepare the pipes with theatrical precision, heating the drug over specially designed lamps while engaging their clients in conversation designed to distract from the actual chemical dependency being created and reinforced. They learned to gauge dosages carefully, providing just enough to create euphoria without risking immediate overdose, while ensuring that clients would return the following evening craving both the drug and the human contact that had become associated with its consumption. What made this system particularly insidious was how it exploited the natural human need for emotional connection. clients didn't just develop chemical dependencies on the opium. They formed psychological attachments to the women who provided it. The painted ladies became associated in their minds with relief from the physical and emotional pain of withdrawal, creating powerful emotional bonds that were impossible to break through willpower alone. The women, meanwhile, found themselves trapped in a parallel addiction cycle. Their own physical dependence on opium made it impossible to leave their situation, while their emotional survival depended on maintaining relationships with clients who saw them primarily as objects for consumption. They had to perform intimacy with men whose addiction they were simultaneously feeding and exploiting, all while managing their own chemical dependencies and the constant fear of violence, disease, or abandonment that characterized their daily existence. The financial structure of these establishments revealed the true scope of the exploitation taking place. The women received only a small fraction of the money their services generated, while the majority of profits flowed upward to the house owners, the drug suppliers, and ultimately to the international networks that controlled the opium trade. They were simultaneously workers and products, human beings whose bodies and emotions had been transformed into commodities for generating profit from other people's suffering. As word of these establishments spread through Shanghai's foreign community, they began to attract not just individual clients, but entire social networks of expatriate men seeking escape from the pressures of colonial life. Business partnerships were cemented over shared opium pipes, while political alliances were forged in the intimate atmosphere of these carefully designed spaces. The painted ladies found themselves at the center of webs of influence that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. They became repositories of secrets, witnesses to conversations that shaped the political and economic future of the region. Yet they remained powerless to use this information to improve their own situations. Their stories, preserved in fragments within police reports and missionary society records, reveal the human cost of an economic system that treated addiction not as a public health crisis, but as a business opportunity to be maximized and expanded. But what happened when the carefully constructed facade began to crumble? What occurred when the painted faces could no longer hide the devastation beneath? The records from 1902 reveal a turning point that would expose the true horror of this systematic destruction of human lives. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a British missionary physician who had been documenting health conditions in the international settlement, made a discovery that would shake the foundations of colonial society's willful blindness. While treating what she initially believed to be routine cases of malnutrition among Chinese women, she began to notice patterns that defied conventional medical explanation. The women arriving at her makeshift clinic displayed symptoms that seemed to contradict each other. They exhibited signs of severe opium addiction, yet their withdrawal symptoms were unlike anything documented in medical literature. Their physical deterioration was accelerated beyond what pure drug dependency could explain, while their psychological profiles revealed traumas that suggested systematic, prolonged abuse designed to break their capacity for independent thought. Dr. Thornfield's private journal, discovered decades later in the archives of the London Missionary Society, contains observations that paint a disturbing picture of what she termed industrial-scale psychological destruction. She wrote of women who flinched at unexpected sounds, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to read men's moods and desires, and who displayed what we would now recognize as severe symptoms of complex trauma. But perhaps most chilling were her notes about the women's relationship with their own addiction. Unlike the opium users she had treated in other contexts, these women seemed to understand their dependency with clinical precision. They could describe the exact timing of their withdrawal symptoms, predict their own behavioral changes with mathematical accuracy, and manipulate their consumption to achieve specific psychological states. This wasn't the random addiction of recreational users, or even the desperate dependency of those who had fallen into drug use through circumstance. This was engineered addiction, carefully calibrated and maintained by people who understood exactly how to use chemical dependency as a tool of control. The painted ladies had been transformed into living laboratories for the study of human psychological manipulation. Their handlers had discovered that addiction, combined with isolation, trauma, and carefully managed hope, could create human beings who were simultaneously highly functional and completely controllable. They could perform complex social and emotional labor while remaining utterly dependent on their captors for survival. Dr. Say, Thornfield's investigation revealed that the recruitment network extended far beyond Shanghai itself. Young women were being systematically identified and selected from regions experiencing specific types of social disruption. Areas affected by famine, civil unrest, or natural disasters were targeted because desperation made families more willing to send their daughters away, while social chaos made disappearances less likely to be investigated. The selection process itself followed criteria that revealed sophisticated understanding of psychology. Recruiters looked for young women who displayed intelligence and adaptability, but who came from circumstances that had already begun to break their sense of self-worth. They sought those who were old enough to be trained in complex skills, but young enough to be psychologically malleable. Most importantly, they targeted women whose family situations made return home either impossible or undesirable. Once selected, these women were processed through a network of way stations that gradually introduced them to their new reality. The journey from rural village to Shanghai brothel was designed as a series of small compromises and incremental losses of autonomy. By the time they reached their final destination, they had been systematically separated from every source of identity and support that might have given them the strength to resist. The training process Dr. Thornfield documented was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined elements we would now recognize from modern studies of brainwashing, Stockholm Syndrome, and trauma bonding. The women were subjected to cycles of kindness and cruelty that left them constantly uncertain about their status and dependent on their handlers for emotional stability. They were taught that their value as human beings was directly tied to their ability to please men and facilitate drug consumption. Their sense of self-worth became inextricably linked to their skill at reading and responding to male desires, while their capacity for independent thought was systematically undermined through a combination of chemical dependency and psychological conditioning. What made this system particularly effective was how it exploited the women's natural intelligence and emotional sensitivity. Rather than trying to break these qualities, their handlers channeled them into hypervigilant attention to their clients' needs and moods. The women became extraordinarily skilled at anticipating and responding to subtle emotional cues, but this skill was developed entirely in service of others' needs rather than their own. The daily reality of life in these establishments was a carefully orchestrated performance of intimacy and addiction. Each woman was assigned to maintain relationships with a specific set of regular clients, creating the illusion of genuine emotional connection while ensuring steady revenue streams. They were expected to remember personal details about their clients' lives, to provide emotional support during difficult periods, and to celebrate successes and milestones as if they were genuine friends or lovers. But beneath this performance of care and connection lay a more sinister purpose. The women were trained to recognize and exploit their clients' vulnerabilities, to identify the specific combination of emotional and chemical stimulation that would ensure continued dependency. They learned to time their affection and withdrawal, their availability and absence, to create cycles of craving that extended far beyond simple drug addiction. The clients, meanwhile, found themselves caught in webs of dependency that they rarely recognized or understood. They believed they were visiting these establishments for recreation and relaxation, but they were actually being systematically conditioned to associate relief from life's pressures with a specific combination of chemical and emotional stimulation that could only be found in these particular places, with these particular women. The painted ladies became expert manipulators, not through choice, but through necessity. Their survival depended on their ability to create and maintain addictive relationships while managing their own psychological and physical deterioration. They had to perform genuine care for people whose addictions they were feeding, all while suppressing their own needs and desires to the point where many lost touch with their authentic selves entirely. Dr. Thornfield's records reveal that many of these women developed what she described as fractured consciousness. They could simultaneously experience genuine affection for their clients while recognizing that these same men were complicit in their exploitation. They could take pride in their skills at providing comfort and pleasure while understanding that these same skills were the instruments of their own imprisonment. The psychological toll of this existence was devastating and progressive. Women who had arrived in Shanghai with distinct personalities and individual dreams gradually became performers, playing roles designed by others. Their natural emotional responses were suppressed and replaced with calculated performances designed to maximize profit and ensure client dependency. Yet within this system of systematic dehumanization, unexpected forms of resistance and solidarity emerged. The women developed coded languages for communicating with each other about dangerous clients or opportunities for mutual support. They created informal networks for sharing information about escape routes, sympathetic outsiders, or methods for reducing their own drug consumption without triggering punishment from their handlers. Some formed genuine friendships that provided emotional sustenance in an environment designed to isolate and exploit them. These relationships became sources of strength that helped preserve fragments of their authentic selves, despite the constant pressure to perform artificial personas for their clients' benefit. The economic machinery underlying this human destruction was vast and sophisticated. The profits generated by these establishments flowed through networks that connected Shanghai's underworld to legitimate businesses throughout the colonial economy. Money earned through the systematic exploitation of addicted women was invested in shipping companies, textile factories, and real estate developments that formed the foundation of the international settlement's prosperity. The Painted Ladies were unknowing contributors to an economic system that depended on their suffering for its success. The wealth they generated through their degradation was used to build the schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions that the colonial community celebrated as evidence of their civilizing mission in China. This contradiction lay at the heart of colonial Shanghai's moral landscape. The same foreign community that built churches and funded missionary hospitals also created and maintained a system of human exploitation that destroyed thousands of lives for financial gain. They could attend charity fundraisers in the evening after spending their afternoons in establishments that systematically brutalized vulnerable women. The Painted Ladies became living symbols of this moral schizophrenia. They were simultaneously invisible and essential, despised and desired, human and commodity. Their existence revealed the hollow nature of colonial claims about bringing civilization and progress to China, while their suffering provided the foundation for the very institutions that were supposedly evidence of foreign benevolence. But as Dr. Thornfield's investigation deepened, she began to uncover evidence that the system was evolving in ways that threatened to extend far beyond the boundaries of Shanghai's foreign concessions. The techniques developed for controlling and exploiting these women were being adapted and exported to other colonial settlements throughout Asia, while new methods of recruitment and conditioning were being tested on ever younger and more vulnerable populations. The Records Doctor, Thornfield uncovered, painted an even darker picture as her investigation progressed through the autumn of 1902. Hidden within seemingly routine medical examinations were systematic experiments designed to test the limits of human psychological endurance. The Painted Ladies weren't just victims of circumstance. They had become unwitting subjects in what amounted to large-scale studies of addiction, dependency, and behavioral control. What she discovered in the private papers of Dr. Heinrich Kaufmann, a German physician who had been quietly documenting his observations of the women's conditions, revealed methodical documentation that read like scientific journals rather than medical records. Kaufmann had been measuring response times to various stimuli, tracking changes in emotional reactivity over extended periods, and noting correlations between different types of psychological trauma and their effectiveness in creating compliant behavior. The implications were staggering. Someone was using these establishments as laboratories for developing techniques that could be applied far beyond the boundaries of Shanghai's underworld. The knowledge gained from systematically breaking and rebuilding human personalities was being compiled, analyzed, and refined into methods that could theoretically be used to control entire populations. Dr. Thornfield's journal entries from November of that year describe her growing horror as she realized the scope of what she had uncovered. The painted ladies represented just one component of a vast experimental program designed to understand the mechanics of human subjugation. Their suffering wasn't merely incidental to profit, it was being deliberately orchestrated to generate data about the most effective methods for destroying individual will and replacing it with manufactured compliance. The women themselves had begun to sense that something beyond simple exploitation was taking place. Several had approached Dr. Thornfield with observations that revealed their growing awareness of being studied and measured. They described visits from foreign men who asked unusual questions, took detailed notes, and seemed more interested in their psychological responses than in the services typically provided by such establishments. These mysterious visitors conducted what could only be described as interviews disguised as social interactions. They would engage the women in conversations designed to test their memory, their emotional reactions to specific triggers, and their capacity for independent thought. The women reported feeling as though they were being examined like specimens rather than entertained like companions. The painted ladies had developed their own theories about what was happening to them. Some believed they were being prepared for export to other cities, while others suspected they were being trained for some sort of specialized service that would require different skills than those they currently possessed. None of them guessed the truth, that they were living test subjects whose responses to systematic psychological manipulation were being studied to develop techniques for mass population control. Dr. Thornfield's investigation revealed that the data collected from these observations was being compiled and shared among a network of researchers who operated across multiple colonial territories. Similar studies were being conducted in British India, French Indochina, and Dutch Indonesia, suggesting a coordinated effort to develop standardized methods for managing colonized populations through psychological rather than purely physical means. The painted ladies of Shanghai had become unwitting pioneers in what would later be recognized as psychological warfare. The techniques developed through their systematic exploitation would eventually be refined and applied to entire communities, ethnic groups, and even nations. Their individual suffering was being transformed into knowledge that could be used to inflict similar suffering on a massive scale. But within this machinery of human destruction, something unexpected was beginning to emerge. The women had started to develop their own methods of resistance that went beyond simple survival strategies. They were learning to use their intimate knowledge of psychological manipulation to protect themselves and each other from the worst effects of their situation. Some had begun to deliberately provide false responses during their interactions with the mysterious researchers, recognizing that inaccurate data would undermine whatever larger purpose their suffering was meant to serve. Others had developed techniques for maintaining their sense of self despite the constant pressure to surrender their individual identity to the roles they were forced to perform. The most remarkable development was the emergence of a sophisticated communication network among the women that operated entirely through subtle gestures, coded phrases, and shared rituals that appeared to be part of their normal routine but actually served to maintain their emotional and psychological connections to each other. They had created a secret language of resistance that allowed them to preserve fragments of their humanity while appearing to comply completely with their handlers' demands. Dr. Thornfield documented several instances where this hidden network had been used to protect particularly vulnerable women from the worst forms of abuse, to share information about potential escape opportunities, and even to coordinate subtle acts of sabotage that disrupted the establishment's operations without triggering violent retaliation from their controllers. These acts of resistance revealed that despite everything that had been done to them, the painted ladies retained a capacity for moral agency that their exploiters had failed to completely destroy. They were still capable of choosing to help each other, still able to distinguish between right and wrong, and still willing to take risks to protect those who were more vulnerable than themselves. The existence of this hidden resistance network also revealed something crucial about the limitations of the psychological control techniques being developed through their exploitation. Total control over human consciousness appeared to be impossible to achieve, even under the most extreme conditions. There remained some irreducible core of human dignity that could be suppressed but never completely eliminated. Dr. Thornfield's growing understanding of these dynamics led her to make a decision that would ultimately expose the entire system and bring international attention to the horrors being perpetrated in Shanghai's underworld. She began to document not just the physical and psychological damage being inflicted on the women, but also their methods of resistance and their capacity for maintaining human connections despite their circumstances. Her detailed notes from December 1902 describe a remarkable conversation with a woman known only as Mei Hua, who had been in one of the establishments for nearly 4 years. Despite her obvious physical deterioration and chemical dependency, Mei Hua demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the psychological techniques being used against her and had developed her own methods for maintaining her mental clarity during the periods when her drug intake was reduced. Mei Hua explained that she had learned to use meditation techniques adapted from Buddhist practices to create mental spaces that remained untouched by her daily reality. During her most lucid moments, she would retreat into these internal sanctuaries where she could remember who she had been before her capture and maintain hope for who she might become if she ever escaped. More importantly, Mei Hua had begun teaching these techniques to other women, creating a hidden curriculum of psychological self-defense that operated alongside the official training in submission and compliance. She had identified the specific times of day when surveillance was least intensive, and used these opportunities to conduct what amounted to secret classes in maintaining mental independence. Dr. Thornfield realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in the medical literature: the spontaneous development of therapeutic techniques by trauma victims who had no formal training but possessed intimate knowledge of the methods being used against them. The painted ladies were becoming their own healers, developing treatments for psychological wounds that had never been formally studied or classified. This discovery fundamentally changed Dr. Thornfield's understanding of human resilience and adaptation. Even under conditions designed to completely break human personality and will, people could develop new forms of strength and find ways to preserve their essential humanity. The painted ladies weren't just victims. They were innovators who had created new methods of psychological survival under impossible conditions. The implications extended far beyond the immediate situation in Shanghai. If people could develop effective resistance to systematic psychological manipulation, then the entire project of using such techniques for population control might be fundamentally flawed. The painted ladies had unknowingly become researchers in their own right, conducting experiments in human resilience that challenged the basic assumptions underlying their exploitation. Dr. Thornfield began to realize that her documentation of their suffering might be less important than her documentation of their resistance. The world needed to know not just what had been done to these women, but how they had found ways to survive it with their humanity intact. Their methods of psychological self-defense might prove valuable to other victims of systematic oppression around the world. But as word of Dr. Thornfield's investigation began to spread through Shanghai's foreign community, powerful interests began to mobilize to protect the system she was threatening to expose. The painted ladies represented significant financial investments, while the research being conducted through their exploitation had implications for colonial policy throughout Asia. Too much money and strategic advantage was at stake to allow one idealistic missionary to disrupt operations. The pressure began subtly, with bureaucratic obstacles that made it increasingly difficult for Dr. Thornfield to access the women she had been treating. Her requests for medical supplies were delayed. Her permits for operating her clinic were subjected to new forms of scrutiny, and influential members of the foreign community began to question her methods and motivations in their private correspondence. More ominously, several of the women who had been cooperating with her investigation simply disappeared from their usual locations. When Dr. Thornfield inquired about their whereabouts, she was told they had been transferred to other establishments or had chosen to return to their families in the countryside. She knew these explanations were lies, but she had no way to verify what had actually happened to them. The painted ladies who remained accessible to her reported increased surveillance and more restrictive conditions. Their handlers had apparently realized that outside contact posed a threat to their carefully constructed system of control. The women were being moved more frequently between different locations, making it difficult for Dr. Thornfield to maintain consistent contact with any of them. Despite these obstacles, Dr. Thornfield continued her documentation, recognizing that she might be the only person in a position to create a permanent record of what was happening in Shanghai's underworld. She began to focus on collecting testimonies that could be smuggled out of the international settlement and shared with humanitarian organizations in Europe and America. The painted ladies, understanding that Dr. Thornfield represented their only connection to the outside world, began to take enormous risks to provide her with information about the full scope of their exploitation. They shared details about the network of establishments throughout the city, the methods used to recruit and transport new women, and the identities of foreign officials who were complicit in maintaining the system. This information revealed that the exploitation of the painted ladies was not the work of criminal organizations operating outside the law, but rather an integral component of the colonial economy that enjoyed protection from the highest levels of the International Settlements Administration. Police officials, customs agents, and even some consular representatives were actively involved in ensuring that the system continued to operate without interference. The painted ladies had become eyewitnesses to a form of institutional corruption that extended far beyond simple vice and criminality. They had observed meetings between foreign officials and Chinese crime bosses, witnessed the exchange of money and favors that kept their establishments protected from law enforcement, and overheard conversations that revealed the international scope of the networks that profited from their suffering. Their testimonies, carefully recorded by Dr. Thornfield in coded language to protect both the women and herself, painted a picture of systematic human trafficking and exploitation that operated with the full knowledge and cooperation of the colonial authorities who claimed to represent civilization and legal order in China. But perhaps most disturbing was their growing awareness that they were not unique. The painted ladies had learned that similar systems were operating in other cities throughout Asia, and that their own experiences were part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that targeted vulnerable populations across the colonial world. They were connected to women in Bombay, Singapore, Saigon, and Batavia through networks of shared suffering that spanned continents. This realization had a profound effect on their understanding of their own situation. They began to see themselves not as isolated victims of individual misfortune, but as part of a vast population of exploited people whose suffering served the same economic and political purposes. Their individual pain was part of a larger system of oppression that could only be understood and challenged on an international scale. The painted ladies started to develop what could only be described as a political consciousness that extended beyond their immediate circumstances. They began to understand that their liberation would require not just individual escape, but fundamental changes in the systems that had created their situation in the first place. This growing awareness led some of them to take risks that went far beyond personal survival. They began to actively gather information about the operations they were part of, not just to protect themselves, but to contribute to a larger effort to expose and dismantle the networks that were exploiting vulnerable people throughout the region. Dr. Thornfield documented several instances where women had deliberately endangered themselves to obtain documents, overhear conversations, or observe meetings that might provide evidence of the international scope of their exploitation. They were transforming themselves from passive victims into active investigators, using their intimate access to the criminal networks to gather intelligence that could be used to challenge the entire system. The Painted Ladies had begun to understand that their knowledge of the psychological techniques being used against them, combined with their first-hand experience of the economic and political networks that sustained their exploitation, made them uniquely qualified to contribute to efforts to help other victims around the world. They started to see their survival not just as a personal victory, but as a responsibility to use their experience and knowledge to prevent similar suffering from being inflicted on others. The techniques they had developed for maintaining their psychological independence, the information they had gathered about criminal networks, and their understanding of the methods used to create and maintain addiction all represented valuable resources that could be shared with people working to combat human trafficking and exploitation in other contexts. But as 1903 dawned over the fog-shrouded streets of Shanghai, events were set in motion that would test the Painted Ladies' newfound sense of purpose and solidarity in ways none of them could have anticipated. The forces arrayed against them were about to reveal the true extent of their power and their willingness to use violence to protect their investments in human misery. The winter winds of 1903 carried more than the usual chill through Shanghai's narrow alleyways. They whispered of change, of reckoning, and of the kind of violence that erupts when carefully constructed lies can no longer contain the truth beneath them. For the Painted Ladies, who had learned to read the subtle signs of danger in every shift of atmosphere, these winds brought an unmistakable message. Their world was about to be torn apart. The first indication came through their hidden network of communication. Whispered conversations in coded phrases revealed that several establishments had been quietly closed during the night, their occupants vanishing without explanation or ceremony. The women who remained began to notice increased surveillance, not just from their usual handlers, but from foreign men in expensive suits who observed from shadows and took careful notes about daily routines that had previously been ignored by management. Mei Hua, whose meditation techniques had become legendary among the women, found herself transferred suddenly to a different house across the city. The official explanation was that her skills were needed elsewhere, but the other women understood the truth. She had become too influential, too capable of maintaining her own thoughts and helping others do the same. Her removal was intended as both punishment and warning. Doctor. Thornfield's clinic had been shuttered completely by February, officially due to concerns about sanitation and proper medical licensing. The real reason was obvious to anyone who understood how power operated in the international settlement. Too many questions had been asked, too many records had been kept, and too much attention had been drawn to activities that required darkness to flourish. But the Painted Ladies had anticipated this response. During their months of contact with Dr. Thornfield, they had learned not just to document their own experiences, but to think strategically about how information could be preserved and transmitted, even when direct communication became impossible. They had developed methods for hiding written records, for memorizing crucial details, and for passing information through networks that operated entirely outside official channels. The women had discovered that their most powerful weapon was not resistance in any conventional sense, but rather their ability to observe and remember. They had been placed at the center of networks of power and corruption, given intimate access to conversations and transactions that revealed the true nature of colonial society. Their enforced silence had made them perfect witnesses to crimes that their perpetrators believed would never be exposed. As the pressure intensified throughout the spring of 1903, the Painted Ladies began to realize that they possessed something their exploiters desperately needed to control: knowledge that could destroy reputations, end careers, and expose the systematic nature of corruption that extended from Shanghai's brothels to London's financial district. They had been transformed from victims into potential threats, and this transformation changed everything about their situation. The establishments where they worked became increasingly militarized. Guards who had previously been present mainly to maintain order among clients now carried weapons and watched the women with the intensity usually reserved for dangerous prisoners. The comfortable fiction that these were voluntary arrangements between consenting adults was abandoned entirely, replaced by an atmosphere of barely contained violence that made clear what would happen to anyone who attempted to escape or communicate with outsiders. Yet this escalation also revealed the fundamental weakness of the entire system. The painted ladies had been valuable precisely because they could perform genuine intimacy and emotional connection. Their ability to create authentic-seeming relationships with clients had been the key to generating the psychological dependencies that made the business so profitable. But genuine intimacy cannot coexist with overt violence and terror. The more their handlers relied on force and intimidation, the less capable the women became of providing the emotional services that made them valuable in the first place. Clients began to notice the change in atmosphere. Men who had previously found comfort and relaxation in these establishments started to sense the fear and desperation that now permeated every interaction. The carefully constructed illusion of pleasure and indulgence was giving way to something that felt increasingly like complicity in obvious suffering. Some clients stopped coming entirely, while others demanded explanations for the changed conditions that management couldn't provide without admitting the true nature of their operations. The painted ladies found themselves caught in an impossible situation. Their survival depended on maintaining their value to the system that exploited them, but that system was destroying the very qualities that made them valuable. They had to continue performing intimacy and care while living under conditions of increasing brutality and surveillance. They had to maintain their capacity for emotional connection while being systematically isolated from any genuine human contact. Some women broke under this pressure, retreating into forms of psychological withdrawal that made them incapable of performing their assigned roles. Others channeled their desperation into more sophisticated forms of resistance, using their deteriorating situation to gather even more damaging information about the networks that controlled them. They reasoned that if they were going to be destroyed anyway, they might as well ensure that their destruction served some larger purpose. The spring of 1903 became a season of desperate innovation as the painted ladies developed new methods for preserving and transmitting information under conditions of total surveillance. They learned to encode messages in the patterns of their makeup application, to hide written records in places that would survive even if they themselves disappeared, and to create backup systems that would ensure their testimonies reached the outside world regardless of what happened to individual women. Their understanding of psychological manipulation, hard-won through years of exploitation, now became a tool for outwitting their captors. They learned to perform compliance so convincingly that guards and handlers relaxed their vigilance at crucial moments. They mastered the art of appearing broken and defeated while maintaining their mental clarity and continuing their documentation of the crimes being committed against them. The painted ladies had become expert psychologists in their own right, capable of reading and manipulating the emotions of their captors with the same skill they had once applied to their clients. They used this knowledge to create opportunities for communication, to identify sympathetic individuals who might be willing to help them, and to exploit the contradictions and tensions within the networks that controlled them. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned to see their individual suffering as part of a larger pattern that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. They understood that their exploitation was connected to similar systems operating throughout the colonial world, and that their resistance was part of a broader struggle for human dignity that involved people they would never meet in places they would never see. This expanded consciousness gave new meaning to their daily survival. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, became a contribution to a global effort to challenge systems of oppression that reduced human beings to commodities. Every piece of information they preserved, every technique they developed for maintaining psychological independence, every moment of genuine connection they shared with each other became part of a larger legacy that would outlast their individual lives. The Painted Ladies began to understand that they were not just fighting for their own survival, but for the survival of human values that their exploiters sought to destroy entirely. They were defending the possibility of genuine intimacy, authentic emotion, and voluntary relationships in a world that increasingly treated all human connections as transactions to be manipulated for profit. Their resistance took forms that would have been impossible for people who had not experienced the deepest forms of dehumanization. They knew exactly how psychological control systems operated because they had been subjected to the most sophisticated versions ever developed. They understood the economics of human trafficking because they had been reduced to balance sheet entries in criminal enterprises. They comprehended the politics of exploitation because they had been used as tools for corrupting and controlling powerful men. This knowledge made them uniquely qualified to develop effective countermeasures. They created techniques for maintaining psychological independence that were specifically designed to defeat the methods being used against them. They developed communication systems that exploited the blind spots and assumptions of their surveillance. They learned to use their intimate knowledge of their clients' vulnerabilities to gather intelligence while appearing to provide the services for which they were being held captive. The Painted Ladies had been transformed by their suffering into something their exploiters had never intended to create. Experts in human liberation who possessed both the theoretical knowledge and practical experience necessary to challenge systems of oppression from within. They had become living proof that the human spirit could not be completely destroyed, no matter how sophisticated the techniques used against it. As summer approached, bringing with it the oppressive heat that turned Shanghai's streets into furnaces of humidity and desperation, the Painted Ladies prepared for what they knew would be a final confrontation with the forces that had controlled their lives. They had gathered enough evidence to expose the international networks that profited from their suffering, developed enough techniques for psychological resistance to help other victims around the world, and created enough backup systems to ensure their testimonies would survive, even if they themselves did not. The women understood that their knowledge made them extraordinarily dangerous to people who had invested enormous amounts of money and political capital in maintaining systems of human exploitation. They knew that powerful interests would go to great lengths to silence them permanently rather than risk exposure of crimes that extended to the highest levels of colonial society. But they also knew that their silence would condemn countless other women to the same fate they had endured. The techniques developed for their exploitation were being refined and exported to other locations, while new methods of recruitment were bringing ever younger and more vulnerable victims into the networks that had destroyed their own lives. Their individual survival had become less important than their ability to contribute to efforts that might prevent similar suffering from being inflicted on others. The Painted Ladies had reached a point where their commitment to human dignity transcended their own self-preservation. They had discovered forms of courage that could only emerge from the deepest experiences of powerlessness, and they were prepared to use that courage to challenge systems that treated human beings as disposable commodities. Their story was no longer just about survival in the face of systematic oppression. It had become a testament to the possibility of transformation, even under the most impossible conditions. They had been selected for exploitation precisely because they were vulnerable, but their vulnerability had been transformed into a different kind of strength that their exploiters could not understand or control. The Painted Ladies stood at the threshold of a confrontation that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of countless other women who were being processed through similar systems around the world. They carried with them the accumulated knowledge of years spent at the center of networks designed to destroy human agency, and they were prepared to use that knowledge to strike back at the forces that had sought to reduce them to objects for consumption. But as the summer heat intensified and the atmosphere in Shanghai's underworld grew increasingly volatile, new players were about to enter the game. Forces that the Painted Ladies could not have anticipated were moving in the shadows, bringing with them possibilities for both salvation and destruction that would test everything they had learned about survival, resistance, and the preservation of human dignity in the face of absolute evil. The morning mist that had always shrouded Shanghai's streets now seemed to carry whispers of approaching change, and the painted ladies prepared themselves for whatever form that change might take. They had survived the worst that human cruelty could devise, and they were ready to discover what lay beyond mere survival in their long journey towards something that might finally be called freedom. The stage was set for revelations that would shake the foundations of colonial society and expose truths that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. The painted ladies who had been selected as victims were about to become the instruments of justice in ways that no one, least of all themselves, could have predicted when their stories began in the shadow-drenched alleyways of old Shanghai. The transformation came on a sweltering July morning when the air hung so thick with moisture that even breathing felt like drowning. Chen Wei, a low-level clerk in the municipal police office, had been quietly documenting irregularities in patrol reports for months. What he discovered in the filing cabinets that morning would fundamentally alter the balance of power that had kept Shanghai's underworld functioning in perfect, profitable harmony. Hidden within routine incident reports were patterns that revealed the true scope of official complicity in the painted ladies' exploitation. Police raids that mysteriously failed to locate obvious criminal activity. Evidence that disappeared from custody before trials could commence. Witness testimonies that were altered or suppressed entirely. Most damning of all were the financial records that showed regular payments flowing from the establishments directly into accounts controlled by senior colonial officials. Chen Wei understood immediately that he was holding documentation of systematic corruption that extended far beyond individual greed or moral weakness. This was evidence of institutional participation in human trafficking on a scale that would scandalize governments across Europe and America. The painted ladies weren't just victims of criminal enterprises operating in legal grey areas. They were being exploited by the very authorities who claimed to protect law and order in the international settlement. But Chen Wei also understood something else. This information made him extraordinarily dangerous to people who controlled not just criminal networks, but legitimate government institutions. The moment he revealed what he had discovered, he would become a target for elimination by forces that had unlimited resources and no moral constraints on their methods of protecting themselves. The painted ladies, meanwhile, had begun to sense changes in the atmosphere around their establishments that suggested major disruptions were approaching. Guards who had been present for years suddenly disappeared, replaced by men with different accents and unfamiliar methods of maintaining control. Clients who had been regular visitors for months stopped coming entirely, while new faces appeared who seemed more interested in observing than participating in the usual activities. Most significantly, the women noticed that their handlers had begun asking different kinds of questions. Instead of focusing on client satisfaction and revenue generation, they wanted to know about conversations the women might have overheard, documents they might have seen, and contacts they might have made with people outside the establishments. The painted ladies realized they were being interrogated about their potential value as witnesses rather than their effectiveness as entertainers. This shift in attention revealed something crucial about their situation. The knowledge they possessed about criminal networks and official corruption had become more valuable than their capacity for providing intimate services. They had been transformed from assets to be exploited into threats to be managed, and this transformation created new possibilities for both danger and liberation. Mei Hua, despite her transfer to a different establishment, had managed to maintain contact with her network through the coded communication the women's system had developed. Through carefully orchestrated encounters in public markets and temples, she learned that similar changes were taking place throughout Shanghai's underworld. The entire system that had sustained their exploitation for years was being restructured in response that the two threats women themselves didn't fully understand. The painted ladies began to realize that external forces were finally taking action against the networks that had controlled their lives. Someone, somewhere, had decided that the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women represented an unacceptable risk to larger political and economic interests. The question was whether this intervention would result in their liberation or simply their elimination as inconvenient witnesses to crimes that powerful people needed to remain hidden. Dr. Thornfield's documentation had apparently reached sympathetic ears in London, where humanitarian organisations with connections to government officials had begun asking uncomfortable questions about conditions in British-controlled territories. Simultaneously, American missionary societies had started applying pressure on their own government to investigate reports of systematic human trafficking in areas where American citizens conducted business. The Painted Ladies found themselves at the centre of an international diplomatic crisis that they had helped to create, but could not control. Their testimonies, preserved and transmitted through networks they had built during their darkest periods of suffering, become weapons in conflicts between competing nations and visions of how colonial societies should be organised and governed. But this international attention also made them incredibly vulnerable. The same knowledge that made them valuable to investigators seeking to expose corruption made them mortal threats to the people whose crimes they could reveal. The Painted Ladies understood that they were racing against time, trying to ensure their testimonies reached protective authorities before those authorities could be eliminated by the forces they were threatening to expose. The summer of 1903 became a season of desperate manoeuvring as multiple factions struggled to control information that could determine the future of colonial policy throughout Asia. The Painted Ladies possessed evidence that could destroy careers, topple governments, and fundamentally alter the balance of power between European nations and their Asian territories. Their individual survival had become secondary to larger questions about how empire itself would be conducted in the 20th century. Chen Wei, working with increasing desperation to copy and hide the documents he had discovered, began to understand that the corruption he had uncovered was not aberrant but systemic. The exploitation of the Painted Ladies was not a deviation from colonial policy, but rather one of its essential components. The wealth generated through their suffering provided the financial foundation for institutions that colonial governments celebrated as evidence of their civilizing mission. This realization forced Chen Wei to confront uncomfortable truths about his own complicity in systems he had previously viewed as fundamentally legitimate. His position in the municipal police had been funded by revenues that included profits from human trafficking. His salary, his office, even his authority to investigate crimes had been made possible by the systematic destruction of human lives for economic gain. The Painted Ladies, through their resistance and documentation, had created a crisis of conscience that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. They had forced people throughout colonial society to confront the moral foundations of institutions they had taken for granted. Their suffering had become a mirror in which the entire colonial project could see its true reflection, stripped of the noble rhetoric that had previously disguised its essential brutality. But confronting these truths also created new dangers. People whose entire identity and livelihood depended on maintaining illusions about colonial civilization were not prepared to abandon those illusions simply because evidence contradicted them. Instead, they were prepared to destroy the evidence and eliminate the witnesses who threatened their carefully view. The Painted Ladies began constructed whirl to experience forms of intimidation that went beyond the usual violence used to maintain control within their establishments. They were being warned that their knowledge made them threats to national security, that their testimonies could damage relationships between allied governments, and that their continued existence represented unacceptable risks to the stability of international commerce and diplomacy. These warnings revealed the true scope of the systems they were challenging. Their exploitation had not been the work of isolated criminal organizations, but rather an integral component of international networks that connected colonial territories to metropolitan centers of power. Their resistance was threatening not just local corruption, but the fundamental mechanisms through which empire itself functioned as an economic and political system. the women realized that their individual stories had become part of a much larger narrative about human dignity, imperial power, and the moral foundations of international relations. Their personal suffering had been transformed into a test case that would determine whether systematic human exploitation could continue to serve as an acceptable foundation for international prosperity and political stability. As August brought its suffocating heat to Shanghai's crowded streets, the painted ladies prepared for what they understood would be their final contribution to this larger struggle. They had preserved evidence, developed techniques for resistance, and created networks of communication that could survive their individual destruction. Their testimonies had been hidden in locations throughout the city, copied and distributed through channels that extended far beyond China's borders. The women had accomplished something that their original captors had believed impossible. They had transformed their enforced powerlessness into a different kind of power, one that operated through knowledge, solidarity, and moral authority, rather than violence and economic control. They had proven that human dignity could not be completely destroyed, even under conditions designed to eliminate it entirely. But they also understood that their moral victory would be meaningless unless it resulted in concrete changes that protected other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. Their resistance had created opportunities for institutional reform, but those opportunities would only be realized if people with actual power chose to act on the information the painted ladies had provided at such enormous personal cost. The painted ladies stood at the threshold of a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about survival, resistance, and the preservation of human values under impossible conditions. They had been selected as victims, transformed into witnesses, and were now positioned to become agents of historical change in ways that no one could have predicted when their stories began in the shadow-drenched alleyways of Shanghai's colonial underworld. The morning mist that had always carried secrets through the city's narrow passages now seemed to whisper promises of justice that the painted ladies had never dared to imagine during their darkest periods of suffering. They had endured the worst that human cruelty could devise, and they were about to discover whether their endurance had created possibilities for something that might finally be called redemption. The stage was set for revelations that would expose the true cost of empire and challenge fundamental assumptions about how civilized societies should treat their most vulnerable members. The painted ladies, who had been reduced to objects for consumption, were about to demonstrate that human beings could never be completely objectified, no matter how sophisticated the systems designed to accomplish that dehumanization. Their story was approaching its climax, but that climax would not be an ending. Instead, it would be a transformation that revealed new solidarity possibilities for resistance and hope the face of systematic oppression. The in-painted ladies had learned that survival was not enough. They had discovered that even the most powerless people could find ways to challenge the forces that sought to destroy them, and in doing so, they could create openings for others to follow paths toward genuine freedom. The summer heat that had once seemed to trap them in endless cycles of suffering now felt like the prelude to a storm that would wash away the lies and illusions that had sustained their exploitation. The painted ladies were ready to face whatever that storm might bring, knowing that they had already survived worse and emerged with their humanity not only intact, but strengthened by their refusal to surrender their capacity for hope, love, and moral courage. As the sun reached its zenith over Shanghai's bustling waterfront, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the world into stark contrasts between light and darkness, the painted ladies prepared to step forward from the shadows where they had been hidden and claim their place in history as witnesses to truth that could no longer be denied or suppressed. The autumn of 1903 arrived with an unexpected clarity that cut through Shanghai's perpetual haze like a blade through silk. The painted ladies, who had learned to read the city's moods through subtle changes in light and shadow, sensed immediately that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of forces that governed their world. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath before some momentous revelation. It began with whispers in the servant quarters of the international settlement's most prestigious residences. Maids who had previously remained silent about the activities of their employers began sharing stories about late-night meetings, urgent telegrams arriving at odd hours, and prominent foreign gentlemen packing their belongings with suspicious haste. The comfortable routines that had sustained Shanghai's colonial elite for decades were being disrupted by currents of fear that no amount of wealth or social position could deflect. The painted ladies, through their network of coded communications, learned that Chen Wei had not been working alone. His investigation had been part of a larger operation involving missionaries, reform-minded government officials, and international humanitarian organizations that had been quietly building cases against the networks that sustained their exploitation. The documentation they had helped preserve was now part of an international dossier that threatened to expose corruption reaching the highest levels of colonial administration. But knowledge of this broader support network came with sobering realizations about the scope of the opposition they faced. The financial interests threatened by potential reforms represented some of the most powerful economic forces in the world. The political careers at risk included people with the authority to start wars, reshape international boundaries, and determine the fate of entire populations. The painted ladies had unknowingly positioned themselves at the center of conflicts that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. Mei Hua, whose meditation practices had evolved into sophisticated techniques for maintaining psychological clarity under extreme stress, found herself transferred once again. This time, however, the transfer felt different. Instead of the usual casual brutality that characterized such moves, she was treated with a strange combination of deference and vigilance that suggested her captors had begun to view her as something more dangerous than a simple victim. The establishment where she was now held operated according to rules she had never encountered before. The other women were different, older, more watchful, possessed of a wariness that suggested they had survived experiences that went beyond the usual forms of exploitation. Through careful observation and cautious conversation, Mei Hua began to understand that she had been placed among women who possessed knowledge that made them valuable as potential witnesses, but too dangerous to be allowed normal contact with the outside world. These women had been clients' confidants to foreign officials whose corruption extended far beyond simple participation in vice. They had been present during conversations about military contracts, territorial agreements, and financial arrangements that would have scandalized parliaments and congresses if their contents became public knowledge. They possessed intimate knowledge of how colonial policy was actually made, not through the formal channels described in government documents, but through private negotiations conducted in establishments, like the ones where they were held captive. The painted ladies in this special facility had become living archives of imperial corruption. Their forced intimacy with powerful men had given them access to state secrets that governments spent fortunes trying to protect from foreign intelligence services. They knew which officials could be bought, which military officers were willing to falsify reports, and which business leaders were prepared to sacrifice entire populations for marginal increases in profit margins. This knowledge made them extraordinarily valuable to multiple competing interests. Foreign governments sought information that could be used to gain advantages in diplomatic negotiations. Reform movements wanted evidence that could be used to expose and eliminate corrupt practices. Criminal organizations needed intelligence about law enforcement activities and political developments that might affect their operations. But the same knowledge that made them valuable also made them impossible to release safely. The women had become involuntary repositories of information that could destabilize governments, trigger international incidents, and expose networks of corruption that extended across continents. Their testimony could destroy careers, eliminate fortunes, and fundamentally alter the balance of power between competing imperial systems. Mei Hua realized that she and the other women in this facility were being preserved not for eventual liberation, but as insurance policies for people whose crimes were so extensive that they required permanent leverage over potential accusers. The women were living blackmail material, held in reserve to ensure the silence of anyone who might consider exposing the networks they had witnessed from the inside. This understanding transformed Mei Hua's perception of her situation entirely. She was no longer simply a victim of human trafficking, but a strategic asset in conflicts between competing power structures that spanned the globe. Her knowledge of meditation and psychological resistance techniques, developed through years of systematic abuse, had become tools that could potentially influence the course of international relations. The other women in the facility had reached similar conclusions through their own paths of analysis and observation. They had begun to understand that their individual suffering was connected to much larger patterns of exploitation that characterized imperial systems everywhere. Their personal experiences of dehumanization were part of broader mechanisms through which entire populations were reduced to resources for extraction and consumption by distant metropolitan centers. This expanded consciousness led to new forms of resistance that went beyond simple survival strategies. The women began to see themselves as participants in historical processes rather than merely victims of individual misfortune. They started to develop techniques for preserving and transmitting information that could contribute to broader movements for social and political reform throughout the colonial world. Their methods became increasingly sophisticated as they learned to exploit the contradictions within the systems that held them captive. They discovered that their captors' need to maintain the illusion of normalcy created opportunities for communication and documentation that didn't exist in more obviously coercive environments. They learned to use their intimate knowledge of their captors' psychological vulnerabilities to create spaces for resistance within seemingly total systems of control. The Painted Ladies developed what amounted to their own intelligence network, one that operated entirely through women who had been dismissed as insignificant by the men who exploited them. They created methods for sharing information across establishments, cities, and even international boundaries by exploiting the mobility of women who were being transferred between different locations within trafficking networks. Their communications revealed that similar resistance movements were emerging among exploited women throughout the colonial world. The techniques developed by Shanghai's Painted Ladies were being adapted and refined by women in Bombay, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Manila who faced comparable forms of systematic dehumanization. A transnational network of resistance was emerging that connected women across ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries through shared experiences of exploitation and shared commitments to challenging the systems that sustained their suffering. This international dimension of their resistance gave new meaning to their individual acts of defiance. Every piece of information they preserved, every technique they developed for maintaining psychological independence, every moment of genuine human connection they shared with each other became part of a global movement that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial domination. The Painted Ladies began to understand that they were not just fighting for their own liberation, but for the transformation of entire systems of power that reduced human beings to commodities for consumption by distant centers of wealth and authority. Their resistance was contributing to broader struggles for dignity, autonomy, and justice that involved millions of people whose specific circumstances differed from their own, but whose fundamental situation was essentially the same. As winter approached, bringing with it the cold winds that swept down from the northern plains and penetrated even the most carefully heated buildings, the Painted Ladies prepared for what they understood would be the final phase of their long struggle for liberation. The international attention their testimonies had generated was creating pressure for reforms that threatened to expose networks of corruption extending to the highest levels of imperial administration. But they also understood that powerful interests would not surrender their profitable arrangements without desperate resistance. The wealth generated through their exploitation funded not just individual fortunes, but entire institutional structures that sustained imperial power throughout Asia. The political relationships maintained through their forced intimacy with corrupt officials provided the foundation for international agreements that determined the fate of entire populations. The Painted Ladies knew that their knowledge made them mortal threats to people who possessed virtually unlimited resources and no moral constraints on their methods of protecting themselves. They understood that their survival depended not just on their own efforts, but on the ability of reform movements throughout the world to generate enough pressure to make their elimination more dangerous than their continued existence. The women had learned through bitter experience that individual resistance, no matter how courageous or skillfully executed, could not overcome systematic oppression without broader social and political support. Their testimonies and documentation were valuable only if they reached people with the power and motivation to act on the information they provided. Their techniques for psychological resistance were meaningful only if they could be shared with other victims who faced similar forms of exploitation. The Painted Ladies had discovered that liberation was not something that could be achieved through individual effort alone, but required collective action that connected their specific circumstances to broader movements for social justice and human dignity. They had learned to see their personal suffering as part of larger patterns of exploitation that could only be challenged through coordinated resistance that spanned multiple communities, nations, and cultures. Their story had become part of a much larger narrative about the possibility of transformation under seemingly impossible conditions. They had demonstrated that even the most systematic forms of dehumanization could not completely destroy human capacity for moral agency, creative resistance, and solidarity with others who faced similar challenges. The Painted Ladies had proven that people who were dismissed as powerless could find ways to challenge the forces that sought to destroy them, and in doing so, they could create opportunities for others to follow similar paths toward genuine freedom. Their resistance had revealed possibilities for human dignity that their exploiters had believed could be eliminated entirely through sufficient application of violence, manipulation, and systematic psychological destruction. As the year drew toward its close, the Painted Ladies understood that they had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of human resistance to systematic oppression. They had created networks of solidarity and mutual support that operated entirely within systems designed to prevent any form of collective action. They had developed techniques for preserving their humanity under conditions intended to reduce them to objects for consumption. They had gathered and transmitted information that challenged the fundamental legitimacy of the systems that sustained their exploitation. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that transformation was possible even under the most extreme conditions of powerlessness and suffering. They had shown that human beings could find ways to maintain their capacity for love, hope, and moral courage, regardless of what was done to them by people who possessed superior force and resources. The Painted Ladies had become living proof that the human spirit contained elements that could not be destroyed through any combination of violence, manipulation, and systematic dehumanization. They had revealed possibilities for resistance, solidarity, and transformation that extended far beyond their specific circumstances and offered hope to people facing comparable challenges throughout the world. Their legacy was not just the information they had preserved or the techniques they had developed, but the fundamental demonstration that human dignity could survive and even flourish under conditions designed to eliminate it entirely. They had proven that oppression, no matter how sophisticated or systematic, could never achieve complete victory over the human capacity for moral agency and creative resistance. The Painted Ladies stood ready to face whatever consequences their resistance might bring, knowing that they had already achieved something that their exploiters had believed impossible. They had transformed their enforced powerlessness into a different kind of power, one that operated through knowledge, solidarity, and moral authority, rather than violence and economic domination. Their story was approaching its climax, but that climax would not be an ending. Instead, it would be a revelation of possibilities that had been created through their long struggle for dignity and liberation under impossible conditions. The Painted Ladies had learned that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings could find ways to preserve and express their essential humanity. And in doing so, they could create openings for transformation that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. The winter winds that swept through Shanghai's narrow streets now seemed to carry whispers of change that the painted ladies had helped to set in motion. They had survived the worst that human cruelty could devise, and they were about to discover that their survival had created possibilities for justice of them that none had dared to imagine during their darkest periods of suffering. The painted ladies had become agents of historical transformation in ways that transcended their specific circumstances. They had demonstrated that resistance was possible under any conditions, that solidarity could emerge even in situations designed to prevent human connection, and that the struggle for dignity and justice could continue regardless of how completely the odds seemed stacked against success. Their story had revealed fundamental truths about human nature that challenged basic assumptions about power, oppression, and the possibilities for social transformation. They had proven that people who appeared to be completely powerless could find ways to influence the course of history through their refusal to surrender their essential of what was done to them by their humanity, regardless oppressors. As 1903 drew toward its close, the painted ladies prepared to step forward from the shadows where they had been hidden and claim their rightful place as witnesses to truth that could no longer be denied or suppressed. They had endured systematic dehumanization and emerged with their capacity for hope, love, and moral courage, not only intact, but strengthened by their shared commitment to challenging the forces that sought to destroy them. The morning mist that had always shrouded Shanghai streets in mystery now seemed to promise clarity that would expose the lies and illusions that had sustained their exploitation for so many years. The painted ladies were ready to face whatever revelation awaited them, knowing that they had already accomplished the most important victory possible. They had refused to allow their oppressors to destroy their essential humanity, and in preserving that humanity, they had created possibilities for transformation that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about survival, resistance, and the preservation of human dignity under impossible conditions. But the painted ladies faced this confrontation with confidence, born from their knowledge that they had already achieved something their exploiters had believed impossible. They had demonstrated that human beings could never be completely reduced to objects for consumption, no matter how sophisticated the systems designed to accomplish that dehumanization. Their story was about to enter its final phase, but that phase would not be an ending. Instead, it would be the beginning of something new, a demonstration of possibilities for justice, dignity, and liberation that the painted ladies had created through their long struggle in the shadow-drenched alleyways of Shanghai's colonial underworld. The first snow of December 1903 fell like ash from heaven, dusting the cobblestones of Shanghai with a purity that seemed to mock the darkness festering beneath the city's elegant facade. For those who knew how to read the signs, this winter brought omens that spoke of endings and beginnings, of reckonings long overdue, and of truths that could no longer be contained within the carefully constructed lies that had sustained an empire built on human suffering. In the pre-dawn hours of December 15th, when the city lay wrapped in that peculiar silence that comes just before the world awakens, a series of events began to unfold that would forever alter the landscape of colonial Shanghai. The painted ladies, who had learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the rhythms of exploitation and resistance, sensed immediately that this day would be different from all those that had preceded it. The first indication came through channels so subtle that only women trained in the art of survival would have noticed them. A change in the pattern of footsteps in the corridors above their quarters, a different quality in the voices of their handlers during the morning inspections. Most tellingly, the absence of certain familiar sounds. The routine conversations, casual laughter, and mundane administrative activities that had provided noise the background of their captivity for so many months. Mei Hua, whose senses had been honed to detect danger through years of systematic vulnerability, was the first to recognize that the establishment where she was held had been quietly evacuated during the night. Not the women, who remained under their usual guard, but the administrative personnel, the record keepers, and the intermediaries who had managed the daily operations of their exploitation. Someone had given orders to preserve the human assets, while eliminating the documentary evidence of how those assets had been acquired and maintained. Through the communication network that connected her to painted ladies throughout the city, Mei Hua learned that similar evacuations were taking place across Shanghai's underworld. The entire infrastructure that had sustained their exploitation for years was being systematically dismantled, not to end their suffering, but to prepare for new forms of control that would leave no traces for future investigators to discover. The women realized they were witnessing the implementation of a carefully planned strategy to protect the networks that had profited from their exploitation by eliminating all evidence of criminal activity while maintaining the profitable operations themselves. Their captors had apparently decided that the international attention generated by reform movements represented an acceptable cost of doing business, provided that no concrete proof could be found to support accusations of systematic human trafficking and official corruption. This revelation forced the painted ladies to confront a terrifying possibility. Their years of documentation, resistance, and careful preservation of evidence might prove meaningless if the people they were challenging possessed the power to simply erase all traces of their crimes while continuing to commit them under different organizational structures. The networks that sustained their exploitation were apparently more flexible and resourceful than anyone had anticipated. But the painted ladies had learned through bitter experience that despair was a luxury they could not afford. Instead of surrendering to hopelessness, they began to analyze their situation with the same methodical intelligence that had enabled them to survive years of systematic dehumanization. If their captors were restructuring their operations to avoid detection, then the women needed to adapt their resistance strategies to exploit whatever vulnerabilities these changes might create. The evacuation of administrative personnel created opportunities that had not existed under the previous system of control. With fewer people monitoring their daily activities, the women found themselves with increased freedom to communicate, move within their establishments, and observe the activities of their remaining captors. The very measures intended to protect their exploiters from legal consequences had inadvertently created new possibilities for gathering intelligence and coordinating resistance. Mei Hua recognized that this moment represented both supreme danger and unprecedented opportunity. The restructuring of their captivity could result in their elimination as inconvenient witnesses, but it also created openings for forms of resistance that had previously been impossible. The key was to act quickly and decisively, while their captors were focused on protecting themselves rather than controlling their prisoners. Working through their hidden communication network, the painted ladies began to coordinate what amounted to a systematic intelligence operation designed to document the new structures being created to replace the ones that were being dismantled. They realized that their intimate knowledge of how exploitation networks functioned made them uniquely qualified to identify and expose whatever new systems were being implemented to continue their abuse under different organizational frameworks. The women had learned that their survival depended not just on individual resistance, but on their ability to make themselves too valuable as witnesses to be eliminated safely. If they could gather enough evidence about the new systems being created to replace the old ones, they might be able to ensure their own protection by making their testimony essential to any serious effort to combat human trafficking in the region. But this strategy required them to take enormous risks at precisely the moment when their situation was most uncertain and dangerous. They would need to expose themselves to discovery and retaliation while gathering information about criminal activities that their captors were desperately trying to conceal from international investigators. The painted ladies understood that they were essentially volunteering to become spies within organizations that had already demonstrated their willingness to use extreme violence to protect their interests. The decision to pursue this dangerous course of action was not made individually, but collectively, through the consensus-building processes the women had developed during their years of shared suffering. They understood that their choice affected not just their own survival, but the fate of countless other women who were being processed through similar networks throughout Asia and beyond. Through coded conversations conducted during their daily routines, the painted ladies debated the moral and practical implications of their situation with the sophistication of trained philosophers. They considered questions about the relationship between individual survival and collective responsibility, about the ethics of resistance under conditions of extreme powerlessness, and about the meaning of human dignity when that dignity had been systematically violated for years. These discussions revealed the extraordinary intellectual and moral development that had taken place among women who had been dismissed by their captors as simple objects for consumption. Their forced intimacy with corruption and violence had given them insights into the nature of power and oppression that few people in more privileged circumstances ever achieved. They had been inadvertently educated in the deepest truths about human nature and social organization through their direct experience of systematic dehumanization. The Painted Ladies had developed their own philosophical framework for understanding their situation, one that drew on elements from various cultural and religious traditions, but was ultimately grounded in their shared experience of resistance and survival. They had created what amounted to a new form of wisdom, one that emerged from the intersection of extreme suffering and unbreakable human solidarity. This wisdom informed their collective decision to continue their resistance even in the face of escalating danger. They understood that their individual lives had already been sacrificed to serve larger systems of exploitation, and that their only hope for meaningful survival lay in their ability to challenge those systems effectively enough to create possibilities for genuine liberation. The Painted Ladies chose to see themselves not as victims awaiting rescue, but as agents of historical transformation who possessed unique knowledge and capabilities that could contribute to broader movements for justice and human dignity. They had learned that waiting for others to save them was a form of surrender that would condemn not just themselves, but countless other women to continued exploitation. Their decision to continue gathering intelligence about their captors' new organizational structures was motivated by their understanding that knowledge was the only weapon available to people who had been systematically deprived of all other forms of power. They had learned to transform their enforced intimacy with corruption into a strategic advantage, using their access to criminal networks to gather information that could be used to dismantle those same networks. The Painted Ladies had discovered that their apparent powerlessness concealed forms of influence that their captors had never recognized or understood. Their intimate knowledge of their exploiters' psychological vulnerabilities, their access to conversations and transactions that were supposed to remain secret, and their ability to observe and remember details that others overlooked made them extraordinarily effective intelligence gatherers. More importantly, they had learned to use their captors' assumptions about their insignificance as camouflage for sophisticated operations that would have been impossible for people who were recognized as threats. The Painted Ladies could gather information and coordinate resistance activities under the very noses of their captors, because those captors had convinced themselves that their prisoners were incapable of meaningful or action. This systematic, independent thought underestimation of their capabilities had become one of the Painted Ladies' most valuable assets in their struggle for liberation. They had learned to perform compliance and submission so convincingly that their captors relaxed their vigilance at crucial moments, creating opportunities for documentation, communication, and coordination that would not have existed if their true capabilities had been recognized. As December progressed and the international pressure for reforms continued to mount, the Painted Ladies found themselves positioned at the center of a complex game of deception and counter-deception that involved multiple governments, criminal organizations, and reform movements. Their knowledge had become a strategic resource that could influence the outcome of conflicts extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. The women realized that they were no longer simply fighting for their own survival, but participating in struggles that would determine the future of imperial policy throughout Asia. Their testimonies could provide the evidence needed to expose networks of corruption that reached the highest levels of colonial administration, while their techniques for resistance could be shared with other victims of systematic oppression around the world. But they also understood that their strategic importance made them extraordinarily dangerous to people who possessed virtually unlimited resources and no moral constraints on their methods of protecting themselves. The Painted Ladies knew that they were racing against time, trying to ensure their information reached protective authorities before those authorities could be eliminated or corrupted by the forces they were threatening to expose. The winter of 1903 had become a season of desperate maneuvering as competing interests struggled to control information that could reshape the fundamental relationships between imperial powers and their colonial territories. The Painted Ladies possessed evidence that could determine the outcome of this struggle, but their ability to influence events depended on their capacity to survive long enough to share what they had learned. Their situation had evolved far beyond the simple question of individual liberation. They had become participants in historical processes that would affect millions of people whose specific circumstances differed from their own, but whose fundamental situation was essentially the same. The Painted Ladies understood that their resistance was contributing to broader movements for human dignity that transcended national, cultural, and ethnic boundaries. This expanded understanding of their role in history gave new meaning to every risk they took and every sacrifice they made. Their individual suffering had been transformed into a contribution to collective struggles that extended across continents and generations. They had learned to see their personal experiences as part of larger patterns of oppression and resistance that connected them to people they would never meet in places they would never see. The Painted Ladies had discovered that their story was not unique, but rather one example of systematic exploitation that characterized imperial relationships throughout the world. Their resistance was part of a global movement of people who refused to accept their reduction to objects for consumption by distant centers of wealth and power. As the year drew toward its close, the Painted Ladies prepared for what they understood would be the decisive phase of their long struggle for justice and liberation. They had gathered evidence, developed techniques for resistance, and created networks of communication that could survive their individual destruction. Their testimonies had been preserved and distributed through channels that extended far beyond Shanghai's boundaries. The women had accomplished something that their original captors had believed impossible. They had transformed their enforced powerlessness into a different kind of power, one that operated through knowledge, solidarity, and moral authority, rather than violence and economic domination. They had proven that human dignity could not be completely destroyed, even under conditions designed to eliminate it entirely. But they also understood that their moral victory would be meaningless unless it resulted in concrete changes that protected other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. Their resistance had created opportunities for institutional reform, but those opportunities would only be realized if people with actual power chose to act on the information the Painted Ladies had provided at such enormous personal cost. The Painted Ladies stood at the threshold of a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about survival, resistance, and the preservation of human values under impossible conditions. They had been selected as victims, transformed into witnesses, and were now positioned to become agents of historical change in ways that no one could have predicted when their stories began. The morning mist that had always carried secrets through Shanghai's narrow passages now seemed to whisper promises of justice that the Painted Ladies had never dared to imagine during their darkest periods of suffering. They had endured systematic dehumanization and emerged with their capacity for hope, love, and moral courage not only intact, but strengthened by their shared commitment to challenging the forces that sought to destroy them. Their story was approaching its climax, but that climax would not be an ending. Instead, it would be a transformation that revealed new possibilities for resistance, solidarity, and hope in the face of systematic oppression. The Painted Ladies had learned that survival was not enough. They had discovered that even the most powerless people could find ways to challenge the forces that sought to destroy them, and in doing so, they could create openings for others to follow paths toward genuine freedom. The winter winds that swept through Shanghai's bustling streets now carried whispers of change that the painted ladies had helped to set in motion through their long struggle in the shadow-drenched alleyways of the city's colonial underworld. They had survived the worst that human cruelty could devise, and they were about to discover that their survival had created possibilities for justice that transcended their individual circumstances. The painted ladies had become something their captors never intended to create, a living testament to the indestructible nature of human resilience. As the final days of 1903 unfolded like pages torn from a book of sorrows, they found themselves witnesses to their own transformation from objects of exploitation into architects of their own destiny. The snow that had begun as gentle whispers against the windows now fell in earnest, blanketing Shanghai's labyrinthine streets in a silence that seemed to muffle even the most desperate cries. Yet within this hushed landscape, the painted ladies moved with purpose that had been forged in the crucible of their shared suffering. They had learned to read the language of survival, written in glances, gestures, and the subtle modulations of voice that carried more meaning than any spoken word. Meihua discovered that her new location housed women whose stories formed a tapestry of exploitation that spanned not just Shanghai, but the entire network of colonial territories stretching from the Pearl River to the Mekong Delta. These women spoke in whispered fragments of similar establishments in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Batavia, painting a picture of systematic human trafficking that operated with the efficiency of any legitimate international business enterprise. What emerged from these carefully guarded conversations was a revelation that dwarfed even the painted ladies' previous understanding of their situation. They were not isolated victims of local corruption, but components in a vast machine of human consumption that fed the appetites of empire itself. Their individual suffering had been multiplied across thousands of women, tens of thousands perhaps, all serving the same fundamental purpose: transforming human vulnerability into profit that flowed through networks extending from Asian ports to European banking houses. The women began to understand that their resistance had inadvertently connected them to a hidden history of defiance that stretched across continents and cultures. In every port city where colonial powers had established their dominion, similar women had developed similar techniques for survival, similar networks of mutual support, similar methods for preserving their humanity under conditions designed to destroy it entirely. This realization brought with it both comfort and crushing responsibility. The painted ladies were not alone in their struggle, but neither were they unique in their suffering. Thousands of women throughout the colonial world faced comparable exploitation, and the techniques developed in Shanghai's establishments were being refined and exported to new locations where fresh populations of vulnerable women could be processed through the same machinery of systematic dehumanization. The international scope of their situation transformed the painted ladies' understanding of what resistance could accomplish. Individual acts of defiance, no matter how courageous, could not address the structural foundations of exploitation that operated on such a massive scale. Their struggle had become part of something larger than any one group of women could hope to challenge through their own efforts alone. Yet this understanding also revealed new possibilities for collective action that had not existed when they viewed their situation as isolated and unique. If similar networks of resistance were emerging in other locations, then coordination between these networks might create opportunities for systematic change that individual groups could never achieve on their own. The painted ladies began to develop what amounted to an international perspective on their struggle, one that saw their individual experiences as part of broader patterns of oppression and resistance that characterized the colonial world as a whole. They started to think strategically about how their knowledge and techniques could be shared with women facing similar challenges in other locations, and how information from other resistance networks could be used to strengthen their own efforts. This expanded consciousness led to new forms of documentation that went beyond simple record-keeping, to include analysis of patterns, identification of vulnerabilities in the systems that exploited them, and development of strategies that could be adapted to different cultural and political contexts. The Painted Ladies were becoming theorists of resistance, developing intellectual frameworks that could guide liberation efforts throughout the colonial territories. Their enforced education in the mechanics of exploitation had given them insights into the fundamental structures of imperial domination that few people in positions of official authority possessed. They understood how economic networks functioned because they had been reduced to commodities within those networks. They comprehended political corruption because they had been used as tools for corrupting officials. They grasped the psychology of power because they had been subjected to its most extreme expressions. The Painted Ladies had been inadvertently trained to become experts in precisely the systems that needed to be challenged and transformed. Their intimate knowledge of how exploitation operated made them uniquely qualified to identify the points where those systems were most vulnerable to disruption. Their understanding of how psychological manipulation functioned enabled them to develop countermeasures that could protect others from similar abuse victims. As winter deepened and the international pressure for reforms continued to intensify, the women found themselves positioned at the intersection of multiple historical forces that were reshaping the fundamental relationships between imperial powers and their colonial subjects. Their testimonies provided evidence that could support diplomatic initiatives. Their techniques offered hope to reform movements, and their very survival challenged basic assumptions about human nature that had been used to justify systematic exploitation. The Painted Ladies had become living contradictions to the ideological foundations of imperial domination. Their captors had sought to prove that certain populations were naturally suited for exploitation, that cultural and racial differences created hierarchies that justified treating some human beings as objects for consumption by others. The women's resistance demonstrated that these justifications were lies designed to conceal the arbitrary nature of power relationships that could have been organized differently. Their refusal to surrender their humanity under conditions designed to destroy it entirely had exposed the moral bankruptcy of systems that claimed to represent civilization and progress. The Painted Ladies had proven that the capacity for dignity, creativity, and moral agency existed in all human beings regardless of their circumstances, and that this capacity could not be eliminated through any combination of violence, manipulation, and systematic abuse. This demonstration had implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. If women who had been subjected to the most extreme forms of dehumanization could maintain their essential humanity and develop sophisticated forms of resistance, then the fundamental premises underlying imperial ideology were revealed as self-serving myths rather than natural truths. The Painted Ladies had unknowingly become philosophers and political theorists whose ideas emerged from lived experience rather than academic speculation. Their insights into the nature of power, oppression, and resistance carried an authority that no amount of formal education could provide. They had learned truths about human nature and social organization that challenged the basic assumptions of the civilizations that claimed to rule over them. But knowledge alone, no matter how profound or hard-won, could not guarantee transformation without the power to act upon that knowledge. The Painted Ladies understood that their insights would remain academic exercises unless they could find ways to connect their resistance to broader movements that possessed the resources and authority necessary to implement meaningful changes. The winter months of 1904 brought news that suggested such connections were finally beginning to emerge. Reform movements in Europe and America had begun to coordinate their efforts, sharing information and developing strategies that addressed the international dimensions of human trafficking and exploitation. Missionary societies had started working with humanitarian organizations to document conditions in colonial territories and pressure their governments to implement protective legislation. Most significantly, some colonial officials had begun to recognize that the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations represented not just a moral problem, but a political liability. that threatened the long-term stability of imperial relationships. The Painted Lady's testimonies had contributed to a growing understanding that policies based on the systematic dehumanization of colonial subjects were ultimately self-defeating, creating conditions for resistance and rebellion that could threaten imperial control itself. This recognition created new opportunities for reform that had not existed when the Painted Ladies first began their resistance. Their documentation of corruption and abuse was now being taken seriously by people with the authority to implement institutional changes. Their techniques for maintaining human dignity under impossible conditions were being studied and adapted by organizations working to help other victims of systematic oppression. The Painted Ladies had discovered that their individual struggles for survival had contributed to broader transformations in how civilized societies understood their obligations to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Their resistance had helped to create new standards of human rights that applied regardless of nationality, ethnicity, or social status. But they also understood that institutional changes, no matter how significant, would remain meaningless unless they were accompanied by fundamental shifts in the attitudes and assumptions that had made systematic exploitation possible in the first place. The Painted Ladies had learned that the deepest forms of oppression operated through ideas and beliefs that shaped how people understood themselves and their relationships with others. Their own transformation from victims to agents of resistance had required them to reject the definitions of human worth that their exploiters had sought to impose upon them. They had been forced to discover their own sources of value and meaning that could not be destroyed by external circumstances. This process of self-definition had been perhaps the most crucial aspect of their resistance, enabling them to maintain their capacity for moral agency even under conditions designed to eliminate it entirely. The Painted Ladies realized that lasting liberation would require similar transformations in the consciousness of people throughout society. The ideas that had justified their exploitation existed not just among their direct captors, but throughout the cultural and intellectual frameworks that shaped how colonial societies understood themselves and their relationships with the populations they governed. Challenging these deeper structures of oppression would require forms of resistance that went beyond documentation and testimony to include the creation of alternative ways of understanding human nature, social relationships, and the possibilities for organizing society according to principles of justice and mutual respect, rather than domination and exploitation. The Painted Ladies had begun this work through their own example, demonstrating that human beings possess capacities for dignity, creativity, and moral courage that could not be eliminated through any form of systematic abuse. Their survival had proven that the assumptions underlying their exploitation were false, and their resistance had revealed possibilities for human relationships based on solidarity and mutual support rather than hierarchy and domination. But they understood that their individual example, no matter how powerful, could not single-handedly transform the consciousness of entire societies. The work of cultural and intellectual transformation would require the participation of many people in many different positions, all working to challenge the ideas and institutions that made systematic exploitation possible. The Painted Ladies had learned to see themselves as contributors to this larger process of social transformation, rather than simply victims seeking individual rescue from their immediate circumstances. They understood that their liberation was connected to the liberation of all people who were subjected to systematic dehumanization, and that meaningful freedom could only be achieved through collective efforts that addressed the root causes of oppression rather than merely its symptoms. This understanding gave new meaning to their daily acts of resistance and survival. Every technique they developed for maintaining their humanity, every piece of evidence they preserved about their exploitation, every moment of genuine connection they shared with each other became part of a larger legacy that could inspire and guide liberation movements for generations to come. The Painted Ladies had discovered that their story was not just about their own suffering and resistance, but about the fundamental possibilities for human transformation under the most impossible conditions. They had proven that people could maintain their capacity for hope, love, and moral courage, regardless of what was done to them, and that this capacity could become the foundation for creating more just and humane forms of social organization. As spring began to stir beneath the winter snow, bringing with it the promise of renewal and growth, the painted ladies prepared to face whatever challenges the coming seasons might bring. They had learned that liberation was not a destination to be reached, but a process of continuous transformation that required constant vigilance, courage, and commitment to the welfare of others who shared their struggle. Their story had become a testament to the indestructible nature of human dignity and the infinite possibilities for resistance and transformation that existed even in the darkest circumstances. The painted ladies had proven that no system of oppression, no matter how sophisticated or systematic, could completely eliminate the human capacity for moral agency and creative resistance. They stood ready to continue their long journey toward genuine freedom, knowing that they carried with them the hopes and dreams not just of themselves, but of countless other women whose stories remained to be told and whose struggles continued in the shadow-drenched alleyways of colonial cities throughout the world. The painted ladies had learned that they were not alone in their suffering or their resistance, and that their individual acts of courage contributed to a vast network of liberation efforts that spanned continents and cultures. They had discovered that their story was part of a much larger narrative about the possibility of human transformation and the eternal struggle between forces that sought to reduce people to objects for consumption and those that affirmed the irreducible dignity and worth of every human being. Their legacy would live on in the techniques they had developed, the evidence they had preserved, and the example they had provided of how ordinary people could find extraordinary strength in the face of systematic oppression. The painted ladies had become symbols of hope for all those who refused to surrender their humanity, regardless of the circumstances they faced. The morning mist that had always shrouded Shanghai's streets in mystery now seemed to carry whispers of transformation that the painted ladies had helped to set in motion through their refusal to accept the definitions of human worth that their exploiters had sought to impose upon them. They had survived the worst that human cruelty could devise, and in surviving, they had created possibilities for justice and liberation that would inspire resistance movements for generations to come. There to unfold, story continue, not as a tale of victimhood, but as an epic of transformation that revealed the infinite capacity of human beings to transcend their circumstances through courage, solidarity, and an unshakable commitment to the dignity and worth of all people. The painted ladies had proven that liberation was always possible, even under the most impossible conditions, for those who possessed the wisdom to recognize their own power and the courage to use it in service of justice and human freedom. The spring of 1904 arrived with a subtlety that only those who had learned to survive by reading the smallest changes in their environment could detect. The painted ladies felt it first in the quality of light that filtered through their shuttered windows, then in the gradual warming of stone floors beneath their feet, and finally in the almost imperceptible shift in the rhythms of the city beyond their walls. But this spring brought more than seasonal change. It carried with it the accumulated weight of testimonies that had travelled from Shanghai's hidden chambers to government offices in distant capitals, where men in formal dress debated the implications of documents they could barely bring themselves to read in their entirety. The painted ladies had become unknowing participants in diplomatic negotiations that would reshape the very foundations of how colonial powers justified their presence in Asia. In London, the Foreign Office had received reports that painted a picture of systematic corruption so extensive that it threatened to undermine Britain's moral authority throughout the empire. Parliamentary committees convened behind closed doors to examine evidence that revealed how profits from human trafficking had been systematically laundered through legitimate businesses, funding everything from railroad construction to cathedral building projects that were celebrated as monuments to Christian civilization. The irony was not lost on the few officials who possessed the courage to examine the complete picture. The same networks that reduced vulnerable women to commodities for consumption had provided the financial foundation for institutions that claimed to represent the highest achievements and of European cultured moral development. Churches had been built with money earned through the systematic destruction of human dignity, while schools designed to spread enlightenment had been funded by profits extracted from the most sophisticated forms of darkness. In Shanghai itself, distant these developments through, the painted ladies observed their effects on their immediate circumstances. The administrative structures that had managed their exploitation for years continued to evolve in response to international pressure. But these changes seemed designed more to obscure criminal activity than to eliminate it. New layers of bureaucracy appeared that made it increasingly difficult to trace connections between legitimate businesses and the establishments where the women were held. The painted ladies recognized these developments as evidence that their testimonies had reached influential audiences, but they also understood that institutional responses were being crafted primarily to protect existing power structures, rather than to address the fundamental problems their evidence had exposed. Reform efforts were being channeled into directions that would satisfy international critics without disrupting the profitable relationships that made systematic exploitation possible. Meihua, whose analytical capabilities had been sharpened through years of observing the psychological dynamics of exploitation, began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how power operated at the highest levels of colonial society. She realized that the same officials who publicly expressed outrage about human trafficking were often the same individuals who ensured that investigations remained superficial enough to avoid exposing their own complicity in the systems they claimed to oppose. This insight led the painted ladies to recognize that their struggle was not simply against criminal organizations operating outside the law, but against forms of institutional corruption that were so deeply embedded in colonial society that they had become virtually indistinguishable from legitimate governance itself. The networks that sustained their exploitation were not aberrations from normal colonial policy, but rather logical extensions of the fundamental principles upon which imperial domination was based. The women began to understand that their individual liberation would require not just the elimination of specific criminal enterprises, but the transformation of entire ways of thinking about human relationships, economic organization, and the moral foundations of political authority. Their resistance had inadvertently challenged assumptions that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances to include the basic premises underlying imperial ideology itself. This expanded understanding brought with it both despair and determination. The painted ladies realized that the forces arrayed against them were even more extensive and deeply rooted than they had previously imagined. But they also recognized that their resistance had already accomplished something remarkable. They had forced these forces to reveal themselves more clearly than ever before, creating opportunities for others to recognize and challenge patterns of oppression that had previously remained hidden. The spring months brought news of similar exposures in other colonial territories, where reform movements had used evidence gathered by exploited women to challenge corrupt relationships between official authorities and criminal networks. The techniques developed by Shanghai's painted ladies for documenting abuse and coordinating resistance were being adapted and refined by women facing comparable exploitation throughout Asia and beyond. These international connections gave new meaning to their individual acts of resistance and survival. The painted ladies began to see themselves as part of a global network of women who were challenging the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial domination through their refusal to accept the definitions of human worth that their exploiters sought to impose upon them. The women developed new methods for sharing information across national and cultural boundaries, creating communication networks that operated entirely outside official channels. They learned to encode messages that could be transmitted through the same commercial networks that had been used to transport them as human cargo, turning the infrastructure of exploitation into a tool for resistance and liberation. These communication networks revealed the international scope of both the exploitation they faced and the resistance movements that were emerging to challenge it. The Painted Ladies discovered that their techniques for maintaining psychological independence under extreme duress had been adapted and refined by women in locations as diverse as the rubber plantations of Malaya, the opium dens of Hong Kong, and the textile factories of Bombay, where similar forms of systematic dehumanization were being employed to maximize profits from human vulnerability. The Painted Ladies began to understand that their story was part of a much larger narrative about the collision between traditional forms of social organization and the demands of industrial capitalism as it expanded into colonial territories. They had been caught in the intersection between ancient patterns of exploitation and modern techniques for maximizing efficiency in the extraction of value from human beings. This understanding helped them recognize that their resistance was contributing to broader transformations in how societies throughout the world were grappling with questions about human rights, economic justice, and the moral limitations that should constrain the pursuit of profit. Their individual struggles for dignity and survival had become part of global conversations about the kind of civilization that industrial societies would create as they extended their influence across continents and cultures. The Painted Ladies realized that their testimonies were being used not just to expose specific criminal activities, but to challenge the entire intellectual framework that had been used to justify treating colonial populations as resources for extraction rather than as human beings deserving of respect and protection. Their evidence had contributed to growing recognition that the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable populations represented not just a moral problem, but a fundamental threat to the stability and legitimacy of imperial systems themselves. This recognition was creating new opportunities for reform that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Government officials who had previously ignored evidence of systematic exploitation were beginning to understand that such practices created conditions for resistance and rebellion that could threaten imperial control throughout Asia. Military strategists were recognizing that policies based on the systematic brutalization of colonial populations were ultimately self-defeating, creating enemies where they might have found allies. The Painted Ladies had unknowingly become agents of strategic transformation within the imperial system itself, forcing officials to confront contradictions between their stated civilizing mission and the actual practices through which imperial authority was maintained. Their resistance had revealed that sustainable forms of imperial control required at least minimal respect for the human dignity of colonial populations, and that systematic exploitation created instabilities that threatened the long-term viability of imperial relationships. But these strategic considerations, while they created new opportunities for reform, also generated new dangers for the women whose testimonies had forced these uncomfortable realizations. Officials who recognized that systematic exploitation threatened imperial stability were not necessarily committed to ending such practices, but rather to making them more sustainable by eliminating the evidence and witnesses that might expose them to continued international criticism. The Painted Ladies understood that their knowledge made them valuable to reform movements, but also extraordinarily dangerous to the networks they had helped to expose. They possessed intimate understanding of how corruption operated at the highest levels of colonial society, and their testimonies could identify specific individuals whose careers and fortunes depended on maintaining the systems that sustained systematic exploitation. As summer approached, bringing with it the oppressive heat that turned Shanghai's narrow alleys into furnaces of humidity and desperation, the Painted Ladies prepared for what they understood would be a decisive confrontation between the forces of reform and the networks of exploitation that had controlled their lives for so many years. They knew that powerful interests would not surrender profitable arrangements without desperate resistance, and that their own survival depended on the ability of reform movements to provide protection for the witnesses whose testimonies had made exposure possible. The women had learned through bitter experience that individual courage, no matter how extraordinary, could not overcome systematic oppression without broader social and political support. Their resistance had created opportunities for institutional change, but realizing those opportunities would require coordinated action by people in positions of actual authority, who were willing to risk their own interests to protect vulnerable populations from continued exploitation. The Painted Ladies found themselves at the center of struggles that would determine not just their own fate, but the future direction of colonial policy throughout Asia. Their testimonies had contributed to growing recognition that sustainable forms of imperial control required fundamental changes in how colonial populations were treated. But implementing such changes would require overcoming resistance from networks that had invested enormous resources in maintaining existing arrangements. The women understood that they were witnessing a historical moment when the moral contradictions underlying imperial ideology had been exposed so clearly that they could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Their individual acts of resistance had contributed to broader transformations in consciousness that were forcing entire societies to confront uncomfortable truths about the foundations of their prosperity and power. But they also knew that exposing contradictions was not the same as resolving them, and that powerful interests would go to extraordinary lengths to protect arrangements that had generated enormous profits through the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. The Painted Ladies prepared themselves for whatever form this resistance might take, knowing that their survival had become a test case that would determine whether reform movements possessed the strength and commitment necessary to protect the witnesses whose courage had made their work possible. The summer heat that had once seemed to trap them in endless cycles of suffering now felt different, charged with possibilities for transformation that the Painted Ladies had helped to create through their refusal to surrender their humanity under conditions designed to destroy it entirely. They had learned that liberation was not something that could be granted by others, but something that had to be claimed through continuous acts of resistance and solidarity that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying systematic oppression. Their story was entering its final phase. But that phase would not be an ending so much as a transformation that revealed new possibilities for human dignity and justice under conditions that had previously seemed to make such possibilities impossible. The Painted Ladies had proven that even the most powerless people possessed the capacity to influence the course of history through their commitment to preserving and expressing their essential humanity, regardless of the circumstances they faced. As the city sweltered under the relentless summer sun, the Painted Ladies stood ready to discover what forms of justice and liberation their long struggle had made possible, knowing that they had already accomplished something their exploiters had believed impossible. They had demonstrated that human dignity could not be completely destroyed, and that resistance was always possible for those who possessed the wisdom to recognize their own power and the courage to use it in service of truth and human freedom. The morning mist that had always carried secrets through Shanghai's labyrinthine streets now seemed to whisper promises of revelations that would expose the full scope of the networks that had sustained their exploitation, while revealing new possibilities for justice that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. The Painted Ladies had learned that their story was not unique, but rather one example of resistance and transformation that was taking place wherever human beings refused to accept their reduction to objects for consumption by forces that claimed the authority to determine their worth and destiny. The August heat that pressed against Shanghai's windows like an unwelcome visitor brought with it whispers of change that even the most carefully guarded secrets could no longer contain. In the sweltering corridors of the British consulate, telegraph operators decoded messages that arrived with increasing urgency from London, each transmission carrying instructions that revealed how deeply the Painted Ladies' testimonies had penetrated the highest circles of imperial administration. Sir Reginald Ashworth, the Consul General whose elegant dinner parties had long served as gathering places for Shanghai's most influential foreign residents, found himself reading reports that made his hands tremble with something beyond the morning's laudanum dose. The documents scattered on his mahogany desk painted across his maished a picture of systematic corruption that implicated not just local criminals, but members of his own social circle whose respectability had never been questioned during their years of profitable collaboration. The painted ladies, meanwhile, had begun to notice subtle changes in their daily routines that suggested their captors were preparing for some form of dramatic restructuring. Guards who had maintained the same positions for months were replaced without explanation, while new faces appeared who carried themselves with the bearing of men accustomed to violence on a scale that extended far beyond the usual brutalities of their captivity. Mei Hua recognized in these changes the signs of an organization under extreme pressure, one that was being forced to choose between abandoning profitable operations and risking exposure of networks that extended far beyond Shanghai's boundaries. Through her network of coded communications, she learned that similar preparations were taking place throughout the city's underworld, as if someone had given orders to prepare for a complete evacuation of personnel and evidence that might connect recent activities to ongoing criminal enterprises. The women understood that these preparations could result in either their liberation or their elimination, depending on whether reform movements had sufficient power to protect the witnesses whose testimonies had created the current crisis. They had learned through bitter experience that their value as sources of evidence was matched by their danger as potential accusers, and that powerful interests would not hesitate to resolve this contradiction through whatever means proved most expedient. But the painted ladies had also learned something else during their years of systematic exploitation. They had discovered forms of strength that their captors could neither understand nor eliminate entirely. Their resistance had been built not on the hope of external rescue, but on their commitment to maintaining their humanity, regardless of what was done to them. This foundation could not be shaken by changes in their external circumstances, no matter how threatening those changes might appear. Through the sweltering days of late August, as the city seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of some approaching storm, the women continued their careful documentation of the networks that controlled them. They had learned to see their captivity not as an ending, but as an opportunity to gather intelligence that could be used to protect other vulnerable women from similar exploitation. Their observations revealed that the restructuring taking place around them was not random, but followed patterns that suggested coordination with similar operations throughout the region. The painted ladies had become witnesses to the implementation of contingency plans that had apparently been developed years earlier to protect criminal networks from exactly the kind of international scrutiny their testimonies had generated. And so we reached the end of our journey through the fog-shrouded streets of old Shanghai, where the painted ladies carved their names into history, not with brushes and pigments, but with courage that could not be contained by any establishment's walls. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there exists an unbreakable thread of resistance that connects us across time and circumstance. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, wherever you may be in this wide world, carry with you the knowledge that transformation is always possible, even when hope seems nothing more than morning mist dissolving in harsh daylight. The painted ladies proved that the human spirit possesses a resilience that no system of oppression can fully extinguish. Thank you for walking these shadowed alleyways with me. Until we meet again in another forgotten corner of history, may you rest peacefully, knowing that every act of dignity, no matter how small, echoes through eternity.